Section 21 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finley. Chapter 14, Part 2. "Well, my pet, what do you say to it? Would you like to go?" he asked, as he refolded the note and returned it to his pocket. "I don't know, papa. It seems as if it would be pleasant, as we are both invited. But home is so sweet, and I am so happy just alone with you, that I hardly want to go away. So if you please, papa, I would much rather just leave it all to you." "Well, then, we will stay quietly at home," he said with a gratified look. "And I think it will be much the better plan, for you are not strong enough yet for gaiety, and it would be very little pleasure for you to be there while unable to join in the sports, and obliged always to keep early hours. But we might have a Christmas dinner at home, and invite a few friends to help us eat it. Whom would you like to have?" "Mr. and Mrs. Travilla, and Aunt Adelaide, and Lora, if you please, papa, and anybody else you like," she replied, looking very much pleased. "I should like to have Carrie Howard, but of course I can't, as she is going to have company of her own, and I believe nearly all the little girls I am acquainted with are to be there." "Yes, I suppose so." "Well, we will ask those you have mentioned, and I hope they will come. But there is the tea bell, and I shall carry my dolly out to the dining room," he said, rising with her in his arms. "Papa," she said, when they had returned to their seats by the study fire, "may I give mammy a nice present this Christmas?" "Yes," he replied kindly. "I suppose you would want to give some presents, and I have just been thinking how it might be managed, as you were not fit to shop for yourself. As you have not had any pocket money for several months, I will allow you now to spend as much as you choose, provided you keep within tolerably reasonable bounds," he added, smiling. "So you may make out a list of all the articles you want, and I will purchase them for you. Will that do?" "Oh, nicely, papa!" she cried, clapping her hands with delight. "It was very good of you to think of all that." "The slippers is come, darling. Bill, he fotched them from the city this afternoon," remarked Chloe, as she was preparing her little charge for bed that night. "Oh, have they, mammy? Let me see them," was Elsie's eager exclamation. Chloe went to her room and was back again in a moment with a bundle in her hand, which Elsie immediately seized and opened with eager haste. "Oh, how pretty!" she cried, capering about with them in her hands. "Aren't they, mammy? Won't papa be pleased?" Then starting at the sound of his step in the adjoining room, she threw them into a drawer which Chloe had hastily opened for the purpose. "Elsie," said her father, opening the door and putting in his head, "why are you not in bed, my daughter? You will take cold standing there half undressed. Go to bed immediately." "Yes, papa, I will," she replied submissively, and he drew back his head again and shut the door. "Mighty narrow escape that," remarked Chloe, laughing. "If massa had come jes a minute sooner, de cat been out of de bag sure enough." Elsie made out her list the next day, with the help of some suggestions from her father, and by Christmas Eve all the purchases had been made, and one of the closets in her bedroom was quite filled with packages of various sizes and shapes. The little girl was all excitement, and did not want to go to bed when the hour came. "Please, papa, let me stay up a little longer," she pleaded coaxingly. "I'm not a bit sleepy." "No, my daughter, you must go at once," he said. "Early hours are of great importance in your present state of health, and you must try to put away all exciting thoughts, and go to sleep as soon as you can. You will try to obey me in this?" "Yes, papa. I am sure I ought to be very good when you are so kind and indulgent to me," she replied, as she put up her face for the usual good night kiss. "God bless and keep my little one, and give her many happy returns of this Christmas Eve," said Mr. Dinsmore, folding her to his heart. Elsie had intended to stay awake until her father should be in bed and asleep, and then to steal softly into his room and take away the slippers he usually wore, replacing them with the new ones which she had worked. But now she engaged Chloe to do this for her, and in obedience to his directions endeavoured to put away all exciting thoughts and go to sleep, in which she succeeded much sooner than she could have believed possible. She was up and dressed and saying "Merry Christmas" at her papa's door quite early the next morning. "Come in," said he, "and tell me what fairy has been here, changing my old slippers to new ones." "No fairy at all, papa, but just dear old mammy," she cried, springing into his arms with a merry, ringing laugh. "Ah, but I know very well it wasn't Aunt Chloe's fingers that worked them," he said, kissing her first on one cheek, then on the other. "I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year, my darling. Thank you for your gift. I like it very much, indeed. And now see what papa has for you." And opening a pretty little box that stood on his dressing table, he took from it a beautiful pearl necklace and bracelets, and clasped them around her neck and arms. "Oh, how beautiful! Dear papa, thank you very much!" she exclaimed, delighted. "Your Aunt Adelaide thought you didn't care much for ornaments," he remarked, looking much pleased. "I do when you give them to me, papa," she answered, raising her eyes to his face with one of her sweet, loving smiles. "I'm very glad my present pleases you," he said, "but for fear it should not, I have provided another," and he placed in her hand a very handsomely bound volume of Scott's poems. "I don't deserve it, papa," she said, coloring deeply, and dropping her eyes on the carpet. "You shall have it at any rate," he replied, laying his hand gently on her drooping head. "And now you can finish the Lady of the Lake this afternoon if you like. His prose works I may perhaps give you at some future day, but I do not choose you should read them for some years to come. But now we will lay this book aside for the present, and have our morning chapter together." They had finished their devotions, and she was sitting on his knee, waiting for the breakfast bell to ring. "When did you find an opportunity to work these without letting me into the secret?" he asked, extending his foot and turning it from side to side to look at his slipper. "It puzzles me to understand it, since I know that for weeks past you have scarcely been an hour out of my sight during the day, not since you were well enough to sew," he said, smiling down at her. There was an expression of deep gravity, almost amounting to sadness, on Elsie's little face, that surprised her father a good deal. "All, papa," she murmured. "It makes me feel sad and glad, too, to look at those slippers." "Why, darling?" he asked in a tender tone. "Because, papa, I worked almost the whole of them last summer, in those sorrowful days when I was all alone. I thought I was going to die, papa, for I was sure I could not live very long without you to love me, and I wanted to make something for you that would remind you of your little girl when she was gone, and perhaps convince you that she did really love you, although she seemed so naughty and rebellious." The tears were streaming down her cheeks, and there was a momentary struggle to keep down a rising sob, and then she added, "I finished them since I came here, papa, a little at a time, whenever you were not with me." He was deeply moved. "My poor darling," he sighed, drawing her closer to him, and caressing her tenderly. "Those were sad days to us both, and though I then persuaded myself that I was doing my duty toward you, if you had been taken away from me I could never have forgiven myself, or known another happy moment, but God has treated me with undeserved mercy." After breakfast the house servants were all called in to family worship, as usual, and when that had been attended to, Elsie uncovered a large basket which stood on a side table, and with a face beaming with delight, distributed the Christmas gifts, a nice new calico dress, or a bright colored handkerchief to each, accompanied by a paper of confectionery. They were received with bows and courtesies, broad grins of satisfaction, and many repetitions of "Thank you, Miss Elsie. These berry handsome, berry nice. Just the ting for this chile." Mr. Dinsmore stood looking on highly gratified, and coming in for a share of the thanks. An hour or two later, Elsie's little pony and her father's larger but equally beautiful steed were brought up to the door, and they rode down to the quarter, followed by Jim and Bill, each carrying a good sized basket. And there a very similar scene was gone through with, Elsie finishing up the business by showering sugar plums into the outstretched aprons of the little ones, laughing merrily at their eagerness, and highly enjoying their delight. She half wished for an instant, as she turned her horse's head to ride away again, that she was one of them, so much did she want a share of the candy which her father refused to let her taste, saying it was not fit for her when she was well, and much less now, while she was yet hardly recovered from severe illness. But it was a lovely morning, the air pure and bracing, and everything else was speedily forgotten in the pleasure of a brisk ride with her father. They rode several miles, and on their return were overtaken by Mr. Travilla, who remarked that Elsie had quite a colour, and was looking more like herself than he had seen her since her sickness. He was on horseback, and his mother arrived a little later in the carriage, having called at Roselands on the way, and picked up Adelaide. Lora did not come, as she had accepted an invitation to spend the holidays at Mr. Howard's, where a little girl about her own age, a cousin of Carry's from the north, was spending the winter. Mr. Travilla put a beautiful little pearl ring on Elsie's finger, which she gracefully thanked him for, and then showing it to her father, "See, papa," she said, "how nicely it matches the bracelets." "Yes, daughter, it is very pretty," he replied, "and one of these days, when you are old enough to wear it, you shall have a pin to match." Mrs. Travilla and Adelaide each gave her a handsome book. Adelaide's was a beautifully bound Bible, and Elsie was delighted with all her presents, and thought no little girl could be richer in Christmas gifts than herself. The day passed very pleasantly, for they were quite like a family party, every one seeming to feel perfectly at home and at ease. The negroes were to have a grand dinner at the quarter, and Elsie, who had been deeply interested in the preparations, cake baking, etc., was now very anxious to see them enjoying their feast. So about 1 o'clock she and her father invited their guests to walk down there with them to enjoy the sight. "I, for one, would like nothing better," said Mr. Travilla, offering his arm to Adelaide, while Mr. Dinsmore took Mrs. Travilla, Elsie walking on the other side and keeping fast hold of his hand. They found it a very merry scene, and the actors in it scarcely enjoyed it more than the spectators. Their own dinner was served up somewhat later in the day, and with appetites rendered keen by their walk in the bracing air, they were ready to do it full justice. Adelaide, at her brother's request, took the head of the table, and played the part of hostess very gracefully. "Ah, Dinsmore," remarked Travilla, a little mischievously, glancing from one to the other, "you have a grand establishment here, but it still lacks its chief ornament. Miss Adelaide fills the place to day, most gracefully, it is true, but then we all know she is only borrowed for the occasion." Mr. Dinsmore coloured a little, and looked slightly annoyed. "Elsie will supply that deficiency in a few years," he said, "and until then I think I can depend upon the kindness of my sisters. Besides, Travilla," he added laughingly, "you must not forget the old proverb about people who live in glass houses." "Ah," replied Travilla, looking affectionately at his mother, "I have a mistress for my establishment, and so can afford to wait for Elsie." The child looked up quickly with a slight flush on her face. "You needn't, Mr. Travilla," she said, "for I am never going to leave my father, and you know he promised not to give me away, so if you want a little girl you will have to look somewhere else." "Ah, well, I will not despair yet," he replied laughingly, "for I have learned that ladies, both little and large, very often change their minds, and so I shall still live in hopes." "You know I like you very much indeed, Mr. Travilla, next best to papa, but then I couldn't leave him for anybody, you see," Elsie said in a deprecating tone, and looking affectionately up into his face. "No, my dear, that is quite right, and I don't feel at all hurt," he answered with a good natured smile, which seemed to relieve her very much. Tea was over. The guests had returned to their homes, and Mr. Dinsmore sat by the fire, as usual, with his little girl upon his knee. "We have had a very pleasant day, papa, haven't we?" she remarked. "Yes, darling, I have enjoyed it, and I hope you have too." "Very much indeed, papa, and I do like all my presents so much." "If I should ask you to give me something of yours, would you be willing to do it?" he enquired in a grave tone. "Why, papa," she said, looking up quickly into his face, "doesn't everything I have belong to you?" "In some sense it does, certainly," he replied, "and yet I like you to feel that you have some rights of property. But you do not answer my question." "I can't think what it can be, papa, but I am sure there is nothing of mine that I wouldn't be very glad to give you, if you wanted it," she said earnestly. "Well then," said he, "your aunt gave you a new Bible to day, and as you don't need two, will you give the old one to me?" A slight shade had come over the little girl's face, and she sat for a moment apparently in deep thought. Then looking up lovingly into his face, she replied, "I love it very much, papa, and I don't know whether any other Bible could ever seem quite the same to me. It was mamma's, you know, and it has been with me in all my troubles, and I don't think I could be quite willing to give it to anybody else, but I am very glad to give it to you, my own dear, dear papa," and she threw her arms round his neck. "Thank you very much, my darling. I know it is a very strong proof of your affection, and I shall value it more than its weight in gold," he said, pressing her to his heart, and kissing her tenderly. End of Chapter 14, Part 2.
Section 22 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finley. Chapter 15, Part 1. Wide flush the fields, the softening air is balm. Echo the mountains round, the forest smiles, and every sense and every heart is joy. Thompson. It was spring again, early in April. The air was filled with the melody of birds and balmy with the breath of flowers. All nature was awakening to renewed life and vigor, but not so with our little friend. She had never fully recovered her strength, and as the season advanced and the weather became warmer, she seemed to grow more languid. Her father was very anxious about her, and sending for Dr. Barton one morning, he held a long consultation with him, the result of which was a determination on Mr. Dinsmore's part that he would take his little girl traveling for some months. They would go north immediately, for the doctor said it was the best thing that could be done. In fact, the only thing that would be likely to benefit her. When the doctor had gone, Mr. Dinsmore went to Elsie's little sitting-room, where she was busily engaged with her lessons. "I am not quite ready yet, Papa," she said, looking up as he entered. "Isn't it a little before the time?" "Yes, a little," he replied, consulting his watch, "but you needn't mind that lesson, daughter. I am afraid I have been working you too hard." "Oh, no, Papa, and if you please, I would rather finish the lesson." "Very well, then. I will wait for you," he said, taking up a book. She came to him in a few moments, saying that she was quite ready now, and when he had heard her recitations and praised her for their excellence, he bade her put her books away and come and sit on his knee, for he had something to tell her. "Is it good news, Papa?" she asked, as he lifted her to her accustomed seat. "Yes, I hope you will think so. It is that you and I and Mammy and John are about to set out upon our travels. I am going to take you north to spend the summer, as the doctor thinks that this is the best thing that can be done to bring back your health and strength." Elsie's eyes were dancing with joy. "Oh, how delightful that will be!" she exclaimed. "And will you take me to see Miss Rose, Papa?" "Yes, anywhere that you would like to go. Suppose we make out a list of the places you would like to visit," he said, taking out pencil and paper. "Oh, yes, Papa," she answered eagerly. "I would like to go to Washington to see the Capitol and the President's house, and then to Philadelphia to see Independence Hall, where they signed the Declaration, you know, and then to New York, and then to Boston, for I want to see Bunker Hill and Faneuil Hill, and the places that we read so much about in the history of the Revolution. But, Papa, may I really go wherever I want to?" she asked, interrupting herself in the midst of her rapid enumeration, to which he was listening with an amused expression. "I said so, did I not?" he replied, smiling at her eagerness. "Well, then, Papa, I want to see Lake Champlain and Ontario, yes, and all those great lakes, and Niagara Falls, and to sail up and down the Hudson River and the Connecticut, and I would like to visit the White Mountains, and I don't know where else I would like to go, but that will do pretty well for a beginning, I think," he said, laughing, "and by the time we are through with all those, if you are not ready to return home, you may be able to think of some more. Now, for the time of starting, this is Wednesday. I think we will leave next Tuesday morning." "I am so glad it is so soon," Elsie said with a look of great satisfaction, "for I am in such a hurry to see Miss Rose. Must I go on with the lessons this week, Papa?" "With your music and drawing, but that will be all, except that we will read history together for an hour every day. I know a little regular employment will make the time pass much more quickly and pleasantly to you." Elsie could now talk of very little but her expected journey, and thought that time moved much more slowly than usual. Yet when Monday evening came, and she and her father walked over the grounds, taking leave of all her favorite haunts, everything was looking so lovely that she half regretted the necessity of leaving her beautiful home, even for a few months. They started very early in the morning, before the sun was up, traveling to the city in their own carriage, and then taking the cars. They visited Baltimore and Washington, staying just long enough in each place to see all that was worth seeing. then went on to Philadelphia, where they expected to remain several weeks, as it was there Miss Rose resided. Mr. Allison was a prosperous merchant, with a fine establishment in the city, and a very elegant country seat a few miles out of it. On reaching the city, Elsie was in such haste to see her friend that she entreated her father to go directly to Mr. Allison's, saying she was certain that Miss Rose would wish them to do so. But Mr. Dinsmore would not consent. "It will never do," he said, "to rush in upon our friends in that way, without giving them any warning. We might put them to great inconvenience." So John was sent for a carriage, and they drove to one of the first hotels in the city, where Mr. Dinsmore at once engaged rooms for himself, daughter, and servants. "You are looking tired, my child," he said, as he led Elsie to her room and seated her upon a sofa, "and you are warm and dusty. But Mammy must give you a bath and put on your loose wrapper, and I will have your supper brought up here, and then you must go early to bed. I hope you will feel quite bright again in the morning." "Yes, papa, I hope so. And then you will take me to see Miss Rose, won't you?" she said coaxingly. "I will send them our cards tonight, my dear, since you feel in such haste," he replied in a pleasant tone, "and probably Miss Rose will be here in the morning if she is well and cares to see us." John and the porter were bringing up the trunks. They set them down and went out again, followed by Mr. Dinsmore, who did not return until half an hour afterwards, when he found Elsie lying on the sofa, seeming much refreshed by her bath and change of clothing. "You look better already, dearest," he said, stooping to press a kiss on her lips. "And you too, papa," she answered, smiling up at him. "I think it improves anyone to get the dust washed off. Won't you take your tea up here with me? I should like it so much." "I will, darling," he said kindly. "It is a great pleasure to me to gratify you in any harmless wish." And then he asked her what she would like for her supper, and she told Chloe to ring for the waiter that she might order it. After their tea they had their reading and prayer together. Then he bade her good night and left her, telling Chloe to put her to bed immediately. Chloe obeyed, and the little girl rose the next morning feeling quite rested and looking very well and bright. "How early do you think Miss Rose will come, papa?" was the first question she put to him on his entrance to her room. "Indeed, my child, I do not know, but I certainly should not advise you to expect her before 10 o'clock at the very earliest." "And it isn't 8 yet," murmured Elsie disconsolately. "Oh, papa, I wish you would take me to see her as soon as breakfast is over." He shook his head. "You must not be so impatient, my little daughter," he said, drawing her toward him. "Shall I take you to Independence Hall today?" "Not until Miss Rose has been here, if you please, papa, because I am so afraid of missing her." "Very well, you may stay in this morning if you wish," he replied in an indulgent tone, as he took her hand to lead her down to the breakfast table. So Elsie remained in her room all the morning, starting at every footstep and turning her head eagerly every time the door opened. But no Miss Rose appeared, and she met her father at dinner time with a very disconsolate face. He sympathized in her disappointment, and said all he could to raise her drooping spirits. When dinner was over, he did not ask if he should take her out, but quickly bade her go to Chloe and get her bonnet put on. She obeyed. She knew she must, without a word. But as he took her hand on her return, he led her out. She asked, "Is there no danger that Miss Rose will come while we are gone, papa?" "If she does, my dear, she will leave her card, and then we can go to see her, or very possibly she may wait until we return," he answered in a kind, cheerful voice. "But at any rate you must have a walk this afternoon." Elsie sighed a little, but said no more, and her father led her along, talking so kindly and finding so many pretty things to show her, that after a little she almost forgot her anxiety and disappointment. They were passing a confectioner's, where the display of sweetmeats in the window was unusually tempting. Elsie called his attention to it. "See, papa, how very nice those candies look." He smiled a little, asking, "Which do you think looks the most inviting?" "I don't know, papa. There is such a variety." "I will indulge you for once. It isn't often I do," he said, leading her into the store. "So now choose what you want, and I will pay for it." "Thank you, papa." And the smile that accompanied the words was a very bright one. When they returned to their hotel, Elsie eagerly inquired of Chloe if Miss Rose had been there, and was again sadly disappointed to learn that she had not. "Oh, papa," she said, bursting into tears, "what can be the reason that she doesn't come?" "I don't know, darling," he answered soothingly, "but never mind. She is probably away from home, and perhaps will return in a day or two." The next morning Mr. Dinsmore would not hear of staying in to wait for a call that was so uncertain, but ordered a carriage immediately after breakfast, and had Elsie out sightseeing and shopping all day. One of their visits, one which was particularly pleased and interested the little girl, was to Independence Hall, where they were shown the bell which in Revolutionary days had, in accordance with its motto, proclaimed liberty throughout all the land to all the inhabitants thereof. "I am so glad to have seen it, papa," Elsie said. "I have always felt so interested in its story, and shall never forget it as long as I live." "Yes," he said with a pleased smile, "I was sure you would enjoy seeing it, for I know my little girl is very patriotic." Other historical scenes were visited after that, and thus several days passed very pleasantly. Still there were no tidings of Miss Allison, and at last Elsie gave up expecting her, for her father said it must certainly be that the family had left the city for the summer, although it was so early in the season. So he decided that they would go on and visit Boston and the White Mountains, and perhaps go up the Hudson River too, and to Niagara Falls and the lakes, stopping in Philadelphia again on their return, when their friends would probably be in the city again. It was Saturday morning that he announced his decision to Elsie, adding that they would remain where they were over the Sabbath and leave for New York early Monday morning. Elsie sighed at the thought of giving up for so long a time all hope of seeing Miss Rose, and looked very sober for a little while, though she said nothing. "Well, I believe we have seen all the sights in this city of brotherly love, so what shall we do with ourselves today?" her father asked gaily, as he drew her toward him and playfully patted her cheek. "I should like to go back to the Academy of Fine Arts, if you will take me, papa. There are several pictures there which I very much want to see again." "Then get your bonnet, my pet, and we will go at once," he said, and Elsie hastened to do his bidding. There were few other visitors in the academy when Mr. Dinsmore and his little girl entered. They spent several hours there, almost too much absorbed in studying the different paintings to notice who were coming or going, or what might be passing by them. They themselves, however, were by no means unobserved, and more than once the remark might have been heard from someone whose eyes were turned in that direction, "What a very fine-looking gentleman!" or "What a lovely little girl!" One young lady and gentleman watched them for some time. "What a very handsome and distinguished-looking man he is," remarked the lady in an undertone. "His face looks familiar, too, and yet I surely cannot have met him before." "Yes, he is a fine, gentlemanly-looking fellow," replied her companion in the same low tone, "but it is the little girl that attracts my attention. She is perfectly lovely." "His sister, I presume. There, Rose, now you can see her face," he added, as at that moment Elsie turned toward them. "Oh, it is a dear little face, but can it be? No, surely it is impossible. Yes, yes, it is my own little Elsie." For that instant their eyes met, and uttering a joyful exclamation, the little girl darted across the room and threw herself into the lady's arms, crying, "Oh, Miss Rose, dear, dear Miss Rose, how glad I am! Elsie, darling, why, where did you come from?" And Rose's arms were clasped about the little girl's waist, and she was showering kisses upon the sweet little face. "I did not even know you were in the North," she said presently, releasing her from her embrace, but still keeping fast hold of her hand, and looking down lovingly into her face. "When did you come? And who is with you? But I need scarcely ask, for it must be your papa, of course." "Yes, ma'am," replied Elsie, looking round. "There he is, and see, he is coming toward us. Papa, this is Miss Rose." Rose held out her hand with one of her sweetest smiles. "I am very glad to see you, Mr. Dinsmore, especially as you brought my dear little friend with you. This is my brother Edward," she added, turning to her companion, "Mr. Dinsmore, Edward, and little Elsie, of whom you have so often heard me speak." There was a cordial greeting all around, then questions were asked and answered until everything had been explained. Mr. Dinsmore, learning that Mr. Allison's family were out of the city, passing the summer in their country seat, and had never received his cards, but that today Rose and her brother had come in to do a little shopping, and finding that they had an hour to spare, had fortunately decided to pay a visit to the academy. When these explanations had been made, Edward and Rose urged Mr. Dinsmore to return with them to their home and pay them a long visit, saying that they knew nothing else would at all satisfy their parents, and at length he consented to do so, on condition that they first dined with him at his hotel, to which they finally agreed. Elsie was delighted with the arrangement, and looked happier, her father laughingly affirmed, than she had done for a week. She was seated by Miss Rose at dinner, and also in the carriage during their ride, which was a beautiful one, and just long enough to be pleasant. They had passed a number of very handsome residences, which Rose had pointed out to Elsie, generally giving the name of the occupant, and asking how she liked the place. "Now, Elsie, we are coming to another," she said, laying her hand on the little girl's arm, "and I want you to tell me what you think of it. See that large old-fashioned house built of gray stone there, beyond the avenue of elms? Oh, I like it so much! Better than any of the others. I think I should like to live there." "I am very glad it pleases you," Rose answered with a smile, "and I hope you will live there, at least for some weeks or months." "Oh, it is your home? How glad I am!" exclaimed the little girl as the carriage turned into the avenue. "This is a very fine old place, Miss Allison," remarked Mr. Dinsmore, turning toward her. "I think one might well be content to spend his days here." Rose looked gratified, and pointed out several improvements her father had been making. "I am very proud of my home," she said, "but I do not think it more lovely than Roselands." "Ah, Miss Rose, but you ought to see the Oaks, papa's new place," said Elsie eagerly. "It is much handsomer than Roselands, I think. Miss Rose must visit us next time, papa, must she not?" "If she will, daughter. Miss Allison or any other members of her father's family will always find a warm welcome at my house." Rose had only time to say thank you before the carriage had stopped, and Edward, springing out, was ready to assist the others to alight. End of Chapter 15. Recording by Joyce Martin.
Section 23 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by RoseA. Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finley. Chapter 15, Part 2. Mr. Dinsmore and Elsie were left standing upon the piazza, looking about them, while Edward was engaged for a moment in giving some directions to the coachman, and Rose was speaking to a servant who had come out on their approach. "Mamma is lying down with a bad headache, Mr. Dinsmore, and papa has not yet returned from the city," said Rose, turning to her guests. "But I hope you will excuse them, and Edward will show you to your room and try to make you feel at home." Mr. Dinsmore politely expressed his regret at Mrs. Allison's illness, and his hope that their arrival would not be allowed to disturb her. Miss Allison then left him to her brother's care, and taking Elsie's hand, led her to her own room. It was a large, airy apartment, very prettily furnished, with another a little smaller opening into it. "This is my room, Elsie," said Miss Rose, "and that is Sophie's. You will sleep with her, and so I can take care of you both, for though Chloe can attend you morning and evening as usual, she will have to sleep in one of the servants' rooms in the attic." She had been taking off Elsie's bonnet and smoothing her hair as she spoke, and now removing her own, she sat down on a low seat, and taking the little girl on her lap, folded her in her arms and kissed her over and over again, saying softly, "My darling, darling child, I cannot tell you how glad and thankful I am to have you in my arms once more. I love you very dearly, little Elsie." Elsie was almost too glad to speak, but presently she whispered, "Not better than I love you, dear Miss Rose. I love you next to papa." "And you are happy now?" "Very, very happy. Do you like my papa, Miss Rose?" "Very much, dear, so far," Rose replied with simple truthfulness. "He seems to be a very polished gentleman, and I think is extremely handsome. But what is best of all, I can see he is a very fond father," she added, bestowing another kiss upon the little rosy cheek. "I am so glad!" exclaimed the little girl, her eyes sparkling with pleasure. Then she added, in a deprecating tone. "But he doesn't spoil me, Miss Rose. Indeed he does not. I always know I must obey, and promptly and cheerfully, too." "No, dearest, I did not think you had been spoiled. Indeed, I doubt if it would be possible to spoil you," Rose answered in a tone of fondness. "Ah, you don't know me, Miss Rose," said Elsie, shaking her head. "If papa were not very firm and decided with me, I know I should be very wilful sometimes, and he knows it too. But he is too really kind to indulge me in naughtiness. My dear, dear papa! Miss Rose, I love him so much." "I am so glad for you, my poor little one," murmured Rose, drawing the little girl closer to her. "It seemed so sad and lonely for you, with neither father nor mother to love you. And you were very ill last summer, darling? And very unhappy before that? Your Aunt Adelaide wrote me all about it, and my heart ached for my poor darling. Oh, how I longed to comfort her!" "Yes, Miss Rose, that was a dreadful time. But papa only did what he thought was right, and you cannot think how kind he was when I was getting better." Elsie's eyes were full of tears. "I know it, darling, and I pitied him too, and often prayed for you both," said Rose. "But tell me, dearest, was Jesus near to you in your troubles?" "Yes, Miss Rose, very near and very precious, else how could I have borne it at all? For oh, Miss Rose, I thought sometimes my heart would break." "It was a bitter trial, dearest, I know, and certain I am that you must have had much more than your own strength to enable you to be so firm," said Rose tenderly. "Ah, there is Sophy," she added quickly, as a mass of flaxen curls, accompanied by a pair of dancing blue eyes, appeared for an instant at the door, and then as suddenly vanished. "Sophy, Sophy, come here," she called, and again the door opened, and the owner of the blue eyes and flaxen ringlets, a little girl about Elsie's age, came in and moved slowly towards them, looking at the stranger in her sister's lap with a mingled expression of fun, curiosity, and bashfulness. "Come, Sophy, this is Elsie Dinsmore, whom you have so often wished to see," said Rose. "Elsie, this is my little sister Sophy. I want you to be friends, and learn to love one another dearly. There, Sophy, take her into your room, and show her all your toys and books, while I am changing my dress. That will be the way for you to get acquainted." Sophy did as she was desired, and, as Rose had foreseen, the first feeling of bashfulness soon wore off, and in a few moments they were talking and laughing together as though they had been acquainted as many months. Sophy had brought out a number of dolls, and they were discussing their several claims to beauty in a very animated way, when Rose called them to come with her. "I am going to carry you off to the nursery, Elsie, to see the little ones," she said, taking her young visitor's hand. "Should you like to see them?" "Oh, so much!" Elsie exclaimed eagerly. "If Sophy may go too." "Oh, yes, Sophy will come along, of course," Miss Rose said, leading the way as she spoke. Elsie found the nursery a beautiful large room, fitted up with every comfort and convenience, and abounding in a variety of toys for the amusement of the children, of whom there were 3, the baby crowing in its nurse's arms, little May, a merry romping child of 4 with flaxen curls and blue eyes like Sophy's, and Freddie, a boy of 7. Harold, who was 13, sat by one of the windows busily engaged covering a ball for Fred, who with May stood intently watching the movements of his needle. Elsie was introduced to them all, one after another. Harold gave her a cordial shake of the hand and a pleasant "Welcome to Elmgrove," and the little ones put up their faces to be kissed. Elsie thought Harold a kind, pleasant-looking boy, not at all like Arthur, Fred, and May, dear little things, and the baby perfectly charming, as she afterwards confided to her father. "May I take the baby, Miss Rose?" she asked coaxingly. Miss Rose said yes, and the nurse put it in her arms for a moment. "Dear, pretty little thing!" she exclaimed, kissing it softly. "How old is it, Miss Rose? And what is its name?" "She is nearly a year old, and we call her Daisy." "I'm sure your arms must be getting tired, miss, for she's quite heavy," remarked the nurse presently, taking the child again. Miss Rose now said it was time to go down, and left the room followed by Elsie, Harold, and Sophie, the last named putting her arm around Elsie's waist, saying what a delightful time they would have together, and that she hoped she would stay all summer. They had not quite reached the end of the hall when Elsie saw her father come out of the door of another room, and hastily releasing herself from Sophie's arm, she ran to him, and catching hold of his hand, looked up eagerly into his face, saying, "Oh, papa, do come into the nursery and see the dear little children and the baby. It is so pretty." He looked inquiringly at Miss Allison. "If you care to see it, Mr. Dinsmore," she said, smiling, "there is no objection. We are very proud of our baby." "Then I should like to go," he replied, "both to gratify Elsie and because I am fond of children." Rose led the way, and they all went back to the nursery, where Mr. Dinsmore kissed the little folks all around, patted their heads, and talked kindly to them, then took the babe in his arms, praising its beauty, and tossing it up till he made it laugh and crow right merrily. "I often wish I had seen my baby," he remarked to Rose, as he returned it to the nurse. Then, laying his hand on Elsie's head, "Do you know, Miss Allison," he asked, "that I never saw my little girl until she was nearly 8 years old?" "Yes," she replied, "I knew her before you did, and sympathized strongly in her longing for a father's love." "Ah, we both lost a good deal in those years, and if I could live them over again it should be very different," he said, with a loving glance at his daughter's face. "Nothing should keep me from my child, though no doubt it has all been for the best," he added, with a slight sigh, as he thought of the worldly wisdom he would have taught her. They all now went down to the parlour, where Mr. Dinsmore and Elsie were introduced to Richard Allison, a wild boy, full of fun and frolic, between Rose and Harold in age. Edward was the eldest of the family, and quite sober and sedate. Richard took a great fancy to Elsie from the first moment, and very soon had coaxed her out to the lawn, where he presently engaged her in a merry game of romps, with Sophie, Harold, and himself, which was finally brought to a conclusion by the arrival of the elder Mr. Allison, almost immediately followed by the call to supper. Mr. Allison had a pleasant face, and was a younger-looking man than might have been expected in the father of such a family. He welcomed his guests with the greatest cordiality, expressing the hope that they intended paying a long visit to Elmgrove, which he said they owed him in return for Rose's lengthened sojourn at Roselands. Mrs. Allison also made her appearance at the tea-table, saying that she had nearly recovered from her headache, although she still looked pale and languid. She had a kind, motherly look, and a gentle, winning address that quite took Elsie's fancy, and was evidently pleased at their arrival, and anxious to entertain them in the most hospitable manner. Mr. Dinsmore and his little girl were the only guests, and all the children, excepting the baby, were allowed to come to the table. They seemed to be well-bred children, behaved in a quiet, orderly way, and asked politely for what they wanted, but were rather too much indulged, Mr. Dinsmore thought, as he observed that they all ate and drank whatever they fancied, without any remonstrance from their parents. Elsie was seated between her father and Miss Rose. "Will your little girl take tea or coffee, Mr. Dinsmore?" asked Mrs. Allison. "Neither, thank you, madam. She will take a glass of milk if you have it. If not, cold water will do very well." "Why, Elsie, I thought I remembered that you were very fond of coffee," Rose remarked, as she filled a tumbler with milk, and set it down beside the little girl's plate. "Elsie is a good child, and eats and drinks just whatever her father thinks best for her, Miss Allison," said Mr. Dinsmore, preventing Elsie's reply. "No, no, not any of those, if you please," for Rose was putting hot buttered waffles upon Elsie's plate. "I don't allow her to eat hot cakes, especially at night." "Excuse me, Mr. Dinsmore, but are you not eating them yourself?" asked Rose, with an arch smile. "Yes, Miss Rose, and so may she when she is my age," he answered in a pleasant tone, accompanied by an affectionate glance and smile bestowed upon his little daughter. "I think you are quite right, Mr. Dinsmore," remarked Mrs. Allison. "I know we pamper our children's appetites entirely too much, as I have often said to their father, but he does not agree with me, and I have not sufficient firmness to carry out the reform by myself. No, I like to see them enjoy themselves, And whatever I have, I want my children to have too, said Mr. Allison bluntly. It would seem the kindest treatment at first sight, but I don't think it is in the end, replied Mr. Dinsmore. To buy present enjoyment at the expense of an enfeebled constitution is paying much too dear for it, I think. Ah, young people are full of notions, said the elder gentleman, shaking his head wisely, and are very apt to be much more strict with the first child than with any of the rest. You are bringing this one up by rule, I see. But mark my words, if you live to be the father of as many as I have, you will grow less and less strict with each one, until you will be ready to spoil the youngest completely. I hope not, sir. I am very sure I could not possibly love another better than I do this, Mr. Dinsmore said with a smile, and colouring slightly too, then adroitly changed the subject by a remark addressed to Edward. Immediately after tea the whole family adjourned to the sitting-room. The servants were called in, and Mr. Allison read a portion of Scripture and prayed, afterwards remarking to Mr. Dinsmore that it was his custom to attend to this duty early in the evening, that the younger children might have the benefit of it, without being kept up too late. Mr. Dinsmore expressed his approval, adding that it was his plan also. "Papa," whispered Elsie, who was close to him, "I am to sleep with Sophie." "Ah, that will be very pleasant for you," he said, "but you must be a good girl, and not give any unnecessary trouble." "I will try, papa. There, Sophie is calling me. May I go to her?" "Certainly," and he released her hand, which he had been holding in his. "I want to show you my garden," said Sophie, whom Elsie found in the hall, and she led the way out through a back door which opened into a garden now gay with spring flowers and early roses. Sophie pointed out the corner which was her especial property, and exhibited her plants and flowers with a great deal of honest pride. "I planted every one of them myself," she said. "Harold dug up the ground for me, and I did all the rest. I work an hour every morning pulling up the weeds and watering the flowers." "Oh, won't you let me help you while I am here?" asked Elsie eagerly. "Why, yes, if you like, and your papa won't mind. I think it would be real fun. But he's very strict, isn't he, Elsie? I feel quite afraid of him." "Yes, he is strict, but he is very kind, too." "Let's go in now," said Sophie. "I've got a beautiful picture book that I want to show you, and tomorrow's Sunday, you know. So if you don't see it tonight, you'll have to wait till Monday, because it isn't a Sunday book." "What time is it?" asked Elsie. "I always have to go to bed at 8:30. "I don't know," said Sophie, "but we'll look at the little clock in the dining-room," and she ran in, closely followed by her little guest. "Just 8. We've only got half an hour, so come along. But won't your papa let you stay up longer?" "No," Elsie answered in a very decided tone, and they hurried to the parlour, where they seated themselves in a corner, and were soon eagerly discussing the pictures in Sophie's book. They had just finished, and Sophie was beginning a very animated description of a child's party she had attended a short time before, when Elsie, who had been anxiously watching her father for the last 5 minutes, saw him take out his watch and look at her. "There, Sophie," she said, rising. "I know papa means it is time for me to go to bed. Oh, just wait 1 minute." But Elsie was already halfway across the room. "It is your bedtime, daughter," said Mr. Dinsmore, smiling affectionately on her. "Yes, papa, good night," and she held up her face for the accustomed kiss. "Good night, daughter," he replied, bestowing the caress. Then laying his hand gently on her head, he said softly, "God bless and keep my little one." Rose, who was seated on the sofa beside him, drew Elsie to her, saying, "I must have a kiss too, darling." "Now go, daughter," said Mr. Dinsmore, as Rose released her from her embrace. "Go to bed as soon as you can, and don't lie awake talking." "Mayn't I talk at all after I go to bed, papa?" "No, not at all." Seeing that Elsie was really going, Sophie had put away her book, and was now ready to accompany her. She was quite a talker, and rattled on very fast until she saw Elsie take out her Bible, but then became perfectly quiet until Elsie was through with her devotions, and Chloe had come to prepare her for bed. Then she began chattering again in her lively way, Elsie answering very pleasantly until she was just ready to step into bed, when she said gently, "Sophie, Papa said before I came up that I must not talk at all after I got into bed. So please don't be vexed if I don't answer you, because you know I must obey my father." "Pshaw! How provoking! I thought we were going to have such a good time, and I've got ever so much to say to you." "I'm just as sorry as you are, Sophie, but I can't disobey Papa. He'd never know it," suggested Sophie, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. Elsie started with astonishment to hear Miss Rose's sister speaking thus. "Oh, Sophie, you can't mean to advise me to deceive and disobey my father?" she said. "God would know it, and Papa would soon know it, too, for I could never look him in the face again until I had confessed it." Sophie blushed deeply. "I didn't think about its being deceitful, but would your papa punish you for such a little thing? Papa says disobedience is never a little thing, and he always punishes me when I disobey him. But I wouldn't care so much for that as for knowing that I had grieved him so, because I love my papa very dearly. But I must not talk any more. So good night." And she climbed into bed, laid her head on the pillow, and in a very few moments was fast asleep. End of Chapter 15, Part 2. Recording by RoseA.
Section 24 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finley. Chapter 16, Part 1. Chapter 16. Hail, holy day! The blessing from above brightens thy presence like a smile of love, smoothing like oil upon a stormy sea the roughest waves of human destiny, cheering the good, and to the poor oppressed bearing the promise of their heavenly rest. Mrs. Hale's Prime of Life. When Chloe came in to dress her young charge the next morning, she found her already up and sitting with her Bible in her hand. "Don't make a noise, Mammy," she whispered. "Sophie is still asleep." Chloe nodded acquiescence, and moving softly about, got through the business of washing and dressing her nursling and brushing her curls without disturbing the sleeper. Then they both quietly left the room, and Elsie, with her Bible in her hand, rapped gently at her father's door. He opened it, and giving her a kiss and a "Good morning, darling," led her across the room to where he had been sitting by a window looking into the garden. Then, taking her on his knee and stroking her hair fondly, he said with a smile, "My little girl looks very bright this morning, and as if she has had a good night's rest. I think she obeyed me and did not lie awake talking." "No, Papa, I did not, though I wanted to very much," she answered with a slight blush. "We did not have our chapter together last night," he said, opening the Bible, "but I hope we will not miss it very often." Their plan was to read verse about, Elsie asking questions about anything she did not understand, and her father explaining and making remarks, he having read it first in the original and generally consulted a commentator also. Then Elsie usually had one or two texts to recite, which she had learned while Chloe was dressing her. After that they knelt down, and Mr. Dinsmore prayed. They never read more than a few verses, and his prayer was always short, so that there was no room for weariness, and Elsie always enjoyed it very much. They had still a little time to talk together before the breakfast bell rang, of which Elsie was very glad, for she had a great deal to say to her father. "It is such a sweet, sweet Sabbath day, Papa," she said, "is it not? And this is such a nice place, almost as pretty as our own dear home, and are they not pleasant people? I think they seem so kind to one another and to everybody." "Which must mean you and me, I suppose. There is no one else here," he answered smilingly. "Oh, the servants, you know, Papa, and the people at the hotel. But don't you think they are kind?" "Yes, dear, they certainly seem to be, and I have no doubt they are." And the baby, Papa, isn't it pretty? And, oh, Papa, don't you like Miss Rose? I hardly know her yet, daughter, but I think she is very sweet-looking, and seems to be gentle and amiable. I am glad you like her, Papa, and I knew you would, Elsie said in a tone of great satisfaction. The church the Allisons attended was within easy walking distance of Elm Grove, and service was held in it twice a day. The whole family, with the exception of the very little children and one servant who stayed at home to take care of them, went both morning and afternoon, and Mr. Dinsmore and Elsie accompanied them. The interval between dinner and afternoon service Elsie spent in her father's room, sitting on a stool at his feet, quietly reading. When they had returned from church, Miss Allison gathered all the little ones in the nursery and showed them pictures, and told them Bible stories until the tea-bell rang, after which the whole family, including children and servants, were called together into the sitting-room to be catechized by Mr. Allison. That was succeeded by family worship, and then they sang hymns until it was time for the children to go to bed. As Elsie laid her head on her pillow that night, she said to herself that it had been a very pleasant day, and she could be quite willing to live at Elm Grove, were it not for the thought of her own dear home in the sunny South. The next morning her father told her they would be there for several weeks, and that he would expect her to practice an hour every morning, Miss Rose having kindly offered the use of her piano, and every afternoon to read for an hour with him, but all the rest of the day she might have to herself, to spend just as she pleased, only, of course, she must manage to take sufficient exercise and not get into any mischief. Elsie was delighted with the arrangement, and ran off at once to tell Sophie the good news. "Oh, I am ever so glad you are going to stay," exclaimed Sophie joyfully. "But why need your papa make you say lessons at all? I think he might just as well let you play all the time." "No," replied Elsie. "Papa says I will enjoy my play a great deal better for doing a little work first, and I know it is so. Indeed, I always find papa knows best." "Oh, Elsie!" Sophie exclaimed, as if struck with a bright thought. "I'll tell you what we can do. Let us learn some duets together." "Oh, that's a good thought," said Elsie. "So we will." "And perhaps Sophie would like to join us in our reading, too," said Mr. Dinsmore's voice behind them. Both little girls turned around with an exclamation of surprise, and Elsie, taking hold of his hand, looked up lovingly into his face, saying, "Oh, thank you, Papa. That will be so pleasant." He held out his other hand to Sophie, asking with a smile, "Will you come, my dear?" "If you won't ask me any questions," she answered a little bashfully. "Sophie is afraid of you, Papa," whispered Elsie, with an arch glance at her friend's blushing face. "And are not you, too?" he asked, pinching her cheek. "Not a bit, Papa, except when I've been naughty," she said, laying her cheek lovingly against his hand. He bent down and kissed her with a very gratified look. Then, patting Sophie's head, said pleasantly, "You needn't be afraid of the questions, Sophie. I will make Elsie answer them all." Elsie and her papa stayed for nearly 2 months at Elm Grove, and her life there agreed so well with the little girl that she became as strong, healthy, and rosy as she had ever been. She and Sophie and Harold spent the greater part of almost every day in the open air, working in the garden, racing about the grounds, taking long walks in search of wild flowers, hunting eggs in the barn, or building baby houses and making tea parties in the shade of the trees down by the brook. There was a district schoolhouse not very far from Elm Grove, and in her rambles the children had made acquaintance with 2 or 3 of the scholars, nice, quiet little girls, who after a while got into the habit of bringing their dinner baskets to the rendezvous by the brook side, and spending their noon recess with Elsie and Sophie, the dinner hour at Mr. Allison's being somewhat later in the day. Sophie and Elsie were sitting under the trees one warm June morning, dressing their dolls. Fred and May were rolling marbles, and Harold lay in the grass with a book in his hand. "There come Hetty Allen and Maggie Wilson," said Sophie, raising her head. "See how earnestly they are talking together. I wonder what it is all about. What's the matter, girls?" she asked as they drew near. "Oh, nothing's the matter," replied Hetty, "but we are getting up a party to go strawberrying. We've heard of a field only 2 miles from here, or at least not much over 2 miles from the schoolhouse, where the berries are very thick. We are going tomorrow because it's Saturday and there's no school, and we've come to ask if you and Elsie and Harold won't go along." "Yes, indeed!" exclaimed Sophie, clapping her hands. "It will be such fun, and I'm sure Mamma will let us go." "Oh, that's a first-rate idea!" cried Harold, throwing aside his book. "To be sure, we must all go." "Will you go, Elsie?" asked Maggie, adding, "We want you so very much." "Oh, yes, if Papa will let me, and I think he will, for he allows me to run about here all day, which I should think was pretty much the same thing, only there will be more fun and frolic with so many of us together, and the berries to pick, too. Oh, I should like to go very much indeed." Hetty and Maggie had seated themselves on the grass, and now the whole plan was eagerly discussed. The children were all to meet at the schoolhouse at 9 o'clock and proceed in a body to the field, taking their dinners along, so as to be able to stay all day if they chose. The more the plan was discussed, the more attractive it seemed to our little friends, and the stronger grew their desire to be permitted to go. "I wish I knew for certain that Mamma would say yes," said Sophie. "Suppose we go up to the house now and ask." "No," objected Harold. "Mamma will be busy now, and less likely to say yes than after dinner, so we had better wait." "Well, then, you all ask leave when you go up to dinner, and we will call here on our way home from school to know whether you are going or not," said Hetty, as she and Maggie rose to go. Harold and Sophie agreed, but Elsie said that she could not know then, because her father had gone to the city and would not be back until near tea-time. "Oh, well, never mind. He'll be sure to say yes if Mamma does," said Harold hopefully, and then, as Hetty and Maggie walked away, he began consulting with Sophie on the best plan for approaching their mother on the subject. They resolved to wait until after dinner, and then, when she had settled down to her sewing, to present their request. Mrs. Allison raised several objections. The weather was very warm, the road would be very dusty, and she was sure they would get overheated and fatigued, and heartily wished themselves at home long before the day was over. "Well, then, Mamma, we can come home. There is nothing to prevent us," said Harold. "Oh, Mamma, do let us go just this once," urged Sophie, "and if we find it as disagreeable as you think, you know we won't ask again." And so, at last, Mrs. Allison gave a rather reluctant consent, but only on condition that Mr. Dinsmore would allow Elsie to go, as she said it would be very rude indeed for them to go and leave their little guest at home alone. This conversation had taken place in Mrs. Allison's dressing room, and Elsie was waiting in the hall to learn the result of their application. "Mamma says we may go if your papa says yes," cried Sophie, rushing out and throwing her arms around Elsie's neck. "Oh, aren't you glad? Now, Elsie, coax him hard and make him let you go." "I wouldn't dare to do it. I should only get punished if I did, for papa never allows me to coax or tease, nor even to ask him a second time," Elsie said with a little shake of her head. "Oh, nonsense!" exclaimed Sophie. "I often get what I want by teasing. I guess you never tried it." "My papa is not at all like your father and mother," replied Elsie, "and it would be worse than useless to coax after he has once said no." "Then coax him before he has a chance to say it," suggested Sophie, laughing. "Perhaps that might do if I can manage it," said Elsie thoughtfully. "I wish he would come," she added, walking to the window and looking out. "He won't be here for an hour or two at any rate, if he dined in the city," said Sophie. "Oh, how warm it is! Let us go to our room, Elsie, and take off our dresses and have a nap. It will help to pass away the time until your papa comes." Elsie agreed to the proposal, and before long they were both sound asleep, having tired themselves out with romping and running. When Elsie awoke, she found Chloe standing over her. "You's had a berry good nap, darlin', and you's berry warm," she whispered as she wiped the perspiration from the little girl's face. "Let your old mammy take you up and give you a bath and dress you up nice and clean, 'fore Miss Sophie gets her blue eyes open." "Oh, yes, that will make me feel so much better," agreed the little girl. "And you must make me look very nice, mammy, to please papa. Has he come yet?" "Yes, darlin', massa's been home dis hour, and I spects he's in de parlor dis minute, talking long of Miss Rose and de rest." "Then hurry, Mammy, dress me quickly, because I want to ask papa something," Elsie said in an eager whisper as she stepped hastily off the bed. Chloe did her best, and in half an hour Elsie, looking as sweet and fresh as a new-blown rose in her clean white frock and nicely brushed curls, entered the parlor where her father, Mrs. Allison, Miss Rose, and her elder brother were seated. Mr. Dinsmore was talking with Edward Allison, but he turned his head as Elsie came in and held out his hand to her with a proud, fond smile. She sprang to his side, and still going on with his conversation, he passed his arm around her waist and kissed her cheek, while she leaned against his knee, and with her eyes fixed lovingly upon his face, waited patiently for an opportunity to prefer her request. Miss Rose was watching them, as she often did, with a look of intense satisfaction, for it rejoiced her heart to see how her little friend revelled in her father's affection. The gentlemen were discussing some scientific question with great earnestness, and Elsie began to feel a little impatient as they talked on and on, without seeming to come any nearer to a conclusion. But at last Edward rose and left the room in search of a book which he thought would throw some light on the subject, and then her father turned to her and asked, "How has my little girl enjoyed herself today?" "Very much, thank you, papa, but I have something to ask you, and I want you to say yes. Please, papa, do, won't you?" she pleaded eagerly, but in a low tone only meant for his ears. "You know I love to gratify you, daughter," he said kindly, "but I cannot possibly say yes until I know what you want." "Well, papa," she replied, speaking very fast, as if she feared he would interrupt her, "a good many little girls and boys are going after strawberries tomorrow. They are to start from the schoolhouse at 9 o'clock in the morning and walk 2 miles to a field where the berries are very thick, and they've asked us to go. I mean Harold and Sophie and me, and we all want to go so much. We think it will be such fun, and Mrs. Allison says we may if you will only say yes. Oh, papa, do please let me go, won't you?" Her tone was very coaxing, and her eyes pleaded as earnestly as her tongue. He seemed to be considering for a moment, and she watched his face eagerly, trying to read in it what his answer would be. At length it came, gently but firmly spoken. "No, daughter, you cannot go. I do not at all approve of the plan." Elsie did not utter another word of remonstrance or entreaty, for she knew it would be useless, but and 2 or 3 tears rolled quickly down her cheeks. Her father looked at her for a moment in some surprise, and then said, speaking in a low tone and very gravely, "This will never do, my daughter. Go up to my room and stay there until you can be quite cheerful and pleasant, and then you may come down again." Elsie hurried out of the room, the tears coming thick and fast now, and almost ran against Edward in the hall. "Why, what is the matter, my dear?" he asked in a tone of surprise and alarm, laying his hand on her shoulder to detain her. "Please don't ask me, Mr. Edward. Please let me go," she sobbed, breaking away from him and rushing up the stairs. He stood for an instant looking after her, then turning to go back to the parlor, encountered Rose, who was just coming out. "What ails her?" he asked. "I don't know. Something that passed between her and her father. I rather suspect he sent her upstairs as a punishment." "Pshaw! I've no patience with him. The dear little thing! I don't believe she deserved it." Rose made no reply, but glided upstairs, and he returned to the parlor to finish the discussion with Mr. Dinsmore. In the meantime Elsie had shut herself into her father's room, where she indulged for a few moments in a hearty cry, which seemed to do her a great deal of good, but presently she wiped away her tears, bathed her eyes, and sat down by the window. "What a silly little girl I am," she said to herself, "to be crying just because I can't have my own way, when I know it will not alter papa's determination in the least, and when I know, too, that I have always found his way the best in the end. Oh dear, I have quite disgraced myself before Miss Rose and her mother, and the rest, and vexed papa too. I wish I could be good, and then I might be downstairs with the others instead of alone up here. Well, papa said I might come down again as soon as I could be pleasant and cheerful, and I think I can now. and there is the tea bell." She ran down just in time to take her place with the others. She raised her eyes to her father's face as he drew her chair up closer to the table. The look seemed to ask forgiveness and reconciliation, and the answering smile told that it was granted, and the little heart bounded lightly once more, and the sweet little face was wreathed in smiles. Sophie and Harold were watching her from the other side of the table, and their hopes rose high, for they very naturally concluded, from her beaming countenance, that she had carried her point, and they would all be allowed to go to the strawberry party next day. Their disappointment was proportionally great when, after supper, Elsie told them what her father's answer had really been. "How provoking!" they both exclaimed. "Why, you looked so pleased we were sure he had said yes, and we had quite set our hearts on it." "What is the matter?" asked Richard, who had just come up to them. They explained. "Ah, so that was what you were crying about this afternoon, eh?" he said, pinching Elsie's cheek. "Did you really, Elsie?" asked Sophie in surprise. Elsie blushed deeply, and Richard said, "Oh, never mind. I dare say we've all cried about more trifling things than that in our day. Let's have a good game of romps out here on the lawn. Come, what shall it be, Elsie?" "I don't care," she replied, struggling to keep down an inclination to cry again. "Puss wants a corner," suggested Harold. "Trees for corners." "Here goes, then," cried Richard. "Sophie, you stand here. Elsie, you take that tree yonder. Here, Fred and May, you can play too. One here and another there, and now I'll be the puss." So the game commenced, and very soon every disappointment seemed to be forgotten, and they were all in the wildest spirits. But after a while, as one romping game succeeded to another, Elsie began to grow weary, and seeing that her father was sitting alone upon the piazza, she stole softly to his side, and putting her arm round his neck, laid her cheek to his. He passed his arm around her waist and drew her to his knee. "Which was my little daughter doubting this afternoon?" he asked gently, as he laid her head against his breast, "Papa's wisdom or his love?" "I don't know, Papa. Please don't ask me. I am very sorry and ashamed," she said, hanging her head and blushing deeply. "I should be very happy," he said, "if my little girl could learn to trust me so entirely that she would always be satisfied with my decisions, always believe that my reasons for refusing to gratify her are good and sufficient, even without having them explained." "I do believe it, Papa, and I am quite satisfied now," she murmured. "I don't want to go at all. Please forgive me, dear Papa." "I will, daughter, and now listen to me. I know that you are not very strong, and I think that a walk for 2 miles or more in this hot June sun, to say nothing of stooping for hours afterwards picking berries, exposed to its rays, would be more than you could bear without injury. And if you want strawberries to eat, you may buy just as many as you please, and indeed you can get much finer ones in that way than you could find in any field. You need not tell me it's the fun you want, and not the berries," he said, as she seemed about to interrupt him. "I understand that perfectly, but I know it would not be enough to pay you for the trouble and fatigue. And now, to show you that your father does not take pleasure in thwarting you, but really loves to see you happy, I will tell you what we have been planning. Miss Rose and her brothers tell me there is a very pretty place a few miles from here where strawberries and cream can be had, and we are going to make up a family party tomorrow, if the weather is favorable, and set out quite early in the morning in carriages. Mrs. Allison will provide a collation for us to carry along, to which we will add the berries and cream after we get there. And we will take books to read, and the ladies will have their work, and the little girls their dolls, and we will spend the day in the woods. Will not that be quite as pleasant as going with the school children?" The little arm had been stealing round his neck again while he was telling her all this, and now hugging him tighter and tighter, she whispered, "Dear Papa, you are very kind to me, and it makes me feel so ashamed of my naughtiness. I always find in the end that your way is best, and then I think I will never want my own way again. But the very next time it is just the same thing over. Oh, Papa, you will not get out of patience with me and quit loving me and doing what is best for me because I am foolish enough to wish for what is not." "No, darling, never. I shall always do what seems to me to be for your good, even in spite of yourself. I, who have so often been guilty of murmuring against the will of my Heavenly Father, who, I well know, is infinite in wisdom and goodness, ought to be very patient with your distrust of a fallible, short-sighted earthly parent. But come, darling, we will go upstairs. We have just time for a few moments together before you go to bed." On going to their bedroom, after leaving her father, Elsie found Sophie already there, impatiently waiting to tell her of the plan for the morrow, which she had just learned from Richard. She was a little disappointed to find that it was no news to Elsie, but soon got over that, and was full of lively talk about the pleasure they would have. "It will be so much pleasanter," she said, "than going berrying with those school children, for I dare say we would have found it hot and tiresome walking all that distance in the sun. So I'm right glad now that your father said no instead of yes, aren't you, Elsie?" "Yes," Elsie said with a sigh. Sophie was down on the floor, pulling off her shoes and stockings. "Why, what's the matter?" she asked, stopping with her shoe in her hand to look up into Elsie's face, which struck her as unusually grave. "Nothing, only I'm so ashamed of crying when papa said I shouldn't go," Elsie answered with a blush. "Dear papa, I always find he knows best, and yet I am so often naughty about giving up." "Never mind, it wasn't much. I wouldn't care about it," said Sophie, tossing away her shoe and proceeding to pull off the stocking. Chloe whispered in Elsie's ear, "Massa not vexed with you, darling?" Elsie smiled and shook her head. "No, mammy, not now." End of chapter 16, part 1. Section 25 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finley. Chapter 16, Part 2. Chapter 16. The little girls were awake unusually early the next morning, and the first thing they did was to run to the window to ascertain the state of the weather. It was all they could desire, a little cooler than the day before, but without the slightest appearance of rain, so the young faces that surrounded the breakfast table were very bright and happy. The carriages were at the door very soon after they left the table. It did not take many minutes to pack them, and then they set off, all in high glee, more especially the little ones. Everything passed off well. There was no accident. All were in good humor, the children on their best behavior, and they found the strawberries and cream very fine, so that when the day was over it was unanimously voted a decided success. A few days after this the children were again in their favorite spot down by the brook. They were sitting on the grass talking, for it was almost too warm to play. "How nice and cool the water looks," remarked Sophie. "Let's pull off our shoes and stockings and hold up our dresses and wade about in it. It isn't at all deep, and I know it would feel so good and cool to our feet." "Bravo! That's a capital idea!" cried Harold, beginning at once to divest himself of his shoes and stockings. Then, rolling his pantaloons up to his knees, he stepped in, followed by Sophie, who had made her preparations with equal dispatch. "Come, Elsie, aren't you going to get in too?" she asked, for Elsie still sat on the bank, making no movement toward following their example. "I should like to very much, but I don't know whether papa would approve of it." "Why, what objection could he have? It can't do us any harm, for I'm sure we couldn't drown if we tried," said Harold. "Come now, Elsie, don't be so silly. I wouldn't ask you to do anything your papa had forbidden. But he never said you shouldn't wade in the brook, did he?" "No, he never said anything about it," she answered, smiling, "for I never thought of doing such a thing before." "Come, Elsie, do," urged Sophie. "It is such fun." And at length Elsie yielded, and was soon enjoying the sport as keenly as the others. But after a while they grew tired of wading, and began to amuse themselves by sailing bits of bark and leaves on the water. Then Harold proposed building a dam, and altogether they enjoyed themselves so thoroughly that they quite forgot how time was passing until the lengthening shadows warned them that it was long past their usual hour for returning home. "Oh, we must make haste home!" exclaimed Harold suddenly. "It can't be very far from tea time, and Mamma won't like it if we are late." They hurried out of the water, dried their feet as well as they could, put on their shoes and stockings, and started on a run for the house. But they had not gone more than half-way when Elsie cried out that she had lost her rings. "Those beautiful rings! Oh, dear, where did you lose them?" asked Sophie. "I don't know at all. I just missed them this minute, and I am afraid they are in the brook." And Elsie turned and ran back as fast as she could, followed by the others. "We'll all hunt," said Harold kindly, "and I guess we'll find them, so don't cry, Elsie," for the little girl was looking much distressed. "Oh, Elsie, I am afraid your papa will be very angry and perhaps whip you very hard," exclaimed Sophie. "They were such pretty rings." "No, he won't whip me. He never did in his life," replied Elsie quickly. "And he has often told me he would never punish me for an accident, even though it should cost the loss of something very valuable. But I am very sorry to lose my rings, because, besides being pretty and worth a good deal of money, they were presents, one from Papa and the other from Mr. Travilla." "But, Elsie, I thought your papa was awfully strict and punished you for every little thing." "No, for disobedience, not for accidents." They searched for some time, looking all about the part of the stream where they had been playing, and all over the bank, but without finding the rings, and at last Elsie gave it up, saying it would not do to stay any longer, and they could look again tomorrow. "Oh, Elsie," cried Sophie as they were starting again for home, "you must have got your dress in the water and then on the ground, for it is all muddy." "Oh dear," sighed Elsie, examining it. "How very dirty and slovenly I must look, and that will vex Papa, for he can't bear to see me untidy. Can't we get in the back way, Sophie, so that I can get a clean dress on before he sees me? I don't mean to deceive him. I will tell him all about it afterwards, but I know he wouldn't like to see me looking so." "Yes, to be sure," Sophie said in reply. "We can go in at the side door and run up the back stairs." "And we may be in time for tea yet, if Papa is as late getting home as he is sometimes," remarked Harold, "so let us run." Mr. Allison was late that evening, as Harold had hoped, and tea was still waiting for him, as they learned from a servant whom they met in passing through the grounds. But when they reached the porch upon which the side door opened, they found, much to their surprise and chagrin, that the ladies were seated there with their work, and Mr. Dinsmore was reading to them. He looked up from his book as they approached, and catching sight of his little girl's soiled dress, "Why, Elsie," he exclaimed in a mortified tone, "can that be you? Such a figure you are! Where have you been, child, to get yourself in such a plight?" "I was playing in the brook, Papa," she answered in a low voice, and casting down her eyes while the color mounted to her hair. "Playing in the brook! That is a new business for you, I think. Well, run up to Aunt Chloe and tell her I want you made decent with all possible haste, or you will be too late for tea. But stay," he added as she was turning to go, "you have been crying. What is the matter?" "I have lost my rings, Papa," she said, bursting into tears. "Ah, I am sorry, more particularly because it distresses you, though. But where did you lose them, daughter?" "I don't know, Papa, but I'm afraid it was in the brook." "Ah, yes, that comes of playing in the water. I think you had better keep out of it in the future, but run up and get dressed, and don't cry any more. It is not worth while to waste tears over them." Elsie hurried upstairs, delivered her father's message, and Chloe immediately set to work, and, exerting herself to the utmost, soon had her nursling looking as neat as usual. Rose had followed the little girls upstairs and was helping Sophie to dress. "Dear, now, darlin', now I tink you'll do," said Chloe, giving the glossy hair a final smooth. "But what's de matter? What my child been cryin' 'bout?" "Because, Mammy, I lost my rings in the brook, and I'm afraid I will never find them again." "No such ting, honey. Here dey is safe and sound. and Chloe opened a little jewel box that stood on the toilet table, and picking up the rings, slipped them upon the finger of the astonished and delighted child, explaining as she did so that she had found them on the bureau where Elsie must have laid them before going out, having probably taken them off to wash her hands after eating her dinner. Elsie tripped joyfully downstairs. "See, Papa, see!" she cried, holding up her hand before him. "They were not lost at all. Oh, I am so glad, aren't you, Papa?" "Yes, my dear, and now I hope you will be more careful in the future." "I will try, Papa, but must I never play in the brook any more? I like it so much." "No, I don't like to forbid it entirely, because I remember how much I used to enjoy such things myself at your age. But you must not stay in too long, and must be careful not to go in when you are heated with running, and always remember to dip your hands in first. And another thing, you must not stay out so late again, or you may give trouble. You must always be ready at the usual hour, or I shall have to say you must sup on bread and water." "Oh, I think that would be rather too hard, Mr. Dinsmore," interposed Mrs. Allison, "and I hope you will not compel me to be so inhospitable." "I hope there is not much danger that I shall ever have to put my threat into execution, Mrs. Allison, for it is not often that Elsie is twice guilty of the same fault. One talking generally does her," he answered, with an affectionate glance at his little daughter. "Then I call her a very good child," remarked the lady emphatically. "It is no unusual thing for mine to require telling half a dozen times. But walk into tea," she added, folding up her work. "Ah, Sophie, I am glad to see you looking neat again. I think you were in no better plight than Elsie when you came in." For some time after this the young people were very careful to come in from their play in good season. But one afternoon they had taken a longer walk than usual, going further down their little brook, and establishing themselves in a new spot where they imagined the grass was greener and the shade deeper. The day was cloudy, and they could not judge of the time so well as when they could see the sun, and so it happened that they stayed much later than they should have done. Elsie was feeling a little anxious, and had once or twice proposed going home, but was always overruled by Harold and Sophie, who insisted that it was not at all late. But at length Elsie rose with an air of determination, saying she was sure it must be getting late, and if they would not go with her, she must go alone. "Well, then, we will go, and I guess it's about time," Harold said, "so come along, Soph, or we'll leave you behind." Elsie hurried along with nervous haste, and the others had to exert themselves to keep up with her. But just as they reached the door, the tea bell rang. The children exchanged glances of fright and mortification. "What shall we do?" whispered Elsie. "Dear, if we were only dressed," said Sophie. "Let's go in just as we are. Maybe no one will notice." "No," replied Elsie, shaking her head. "That would never do for me. Papa would see it in a moment and send me away from the table. It would be worse than waiting to dress." "Then we will all go upstairs and make ourselves decent, and afterwards take the scolding as well as we can," said Harold, leading the way. Chloe was in Sophie's room, waiting to attend her child. She did not fret the little girl with lamentations over her tardiness, but set about adjusting her hair and dress as quickly as possible. Elsie looked troubled and anxious. "Papa will be very much vexed and ashamed of me, too, I am afraid," she said with tears in her eyes. "And, Sophie, what will your mamma say? Oh, how I wish I had come in sooner." "Never mind," replied Sophie. "Mamma won't be very angry, and we'll tell her the sun wouldn't shine, and so how were we to know the time?" Elsie was ready first, but waited a moment for Sophie, and they went down together. Her first sensation on entering the room and seeing that her father's chair was empty was certainly one of relief. When her eyes sought Mrs. Allison's face, it was quite as pleasant as usual. "You are rather late, little girls," she said in a cheerful tone, "but as you are usually so punctual, we will have to excuse you this once. Come, take your places." "It was cloudy, you know, Mamma, and we couldn't see the sun," said Harold, who was already at the table. "Very well, Harold, you must try to guess better next time. Rose, help Elsie to some of that omelet and a bit of the cold tongue." "No, thank you, ma'am. Papa does not allow me to eat meat at night," said the little girl resolutely, turning her eyes away from the tempting dish. "Ah, I forgot, but you can eat the omelet, dear," Mrs. Allison said. "And help her to the honey and a piece of that cheese, Rose, and put some butter on her plate." It cost Elsie quite a struggle, for she was as fond of good things as other children, but she said firmly, "No, thank you, ma'am. I should like the omelet, and the honey, and the cheese too, very much. But as I was late tonight, I can only have dry bread, because you know my papa said so." Harold spoke up earnestly. "But, Mamma, it wasn't her fault. She wanted to come home in time, and Sophie and I wouldn't." "No, Mamma, it wasn't her fault at all," said Sophie eagerly, "and so she needn't have just bread, need she?" "No, Elsie, dear, I think not. Do, dear child, let me help you to something. Here's a saucer of berries and cream. Won't you take it? I feel quite sure your papa would not insist upon the bread and water if he were here, and I am sorry he and Edward happened to be away to tea." "As it was not your fault, Elsie dear, I think you might venture," said Rose kindly. "I wouldn't want you to disobey your papa, but under the circumstances I don't think that it would be disobedience." "You are very kind, Miss Rose, but you don't know papa as well as I do," Elsie replied a little sadly. "He told me I must always be in time to be ready for tea, and he says nothing excuses disobedience, and you know I could have come in without the others, so I feel quite sure I should get nothing but bread for my supper if he were here." "Well, dear, I am very sorry, but if you think it is really your duty to sup on dry bread, we will honor you for doing it," Mrs. Allison said. And then the matter dropped, and Elsie quietly ate her slice of bread and drank a little cold water, then went out to play on the lawn with the others. "Did you ever see such a perfectly conscientious child?" said Mrs. Allison to Rose. "Dear little thing, I could hardly stand it to see her eating that dry bread when the rest were enjoying all the luxuries of the table." "No, Mamma, it fairly made my heart ache. I shall tell her father all about it when he comes in. Don't you think, Mamma, he is rather too strict and particular with her?" "I don't know, Rose dear. I'm afraid she is much better trained than mine, and he certainly is very fond of her and quite indulgent in some respects." "Fond of her? Yes, indeed he is. And she loves him with her whole heart. Ah, Mamma, you don't know how glad it makes me to see it. The poor little thing seemed to be literally famishing for love when I first knew her." When Elsie had done anything which she knew would displease her father, she never could rest satisfied until she had confessed it and been forgiven. Through all her play that evening she was conscious of a burden on her heart, and every now and then her eyes were turned wistfully in the direction from which she expected him to come. But the clock struck 8, and there were no signs of his approach, and soon it was half past, and she found she must go to bed without seeing him. She sighed several times while Chloe was undressing her, and just as she was about leaving her, said, "If papa comes home before I go to sleep, Mammy, please ask him to let me come to him for 1 minute." "I will, darling, but don't you try for to stay awake, 'cause maybe Massa ain't gwine be home till very late, and den he might be vexed with you." It was nearly 10 o'clock when Mr. Dinsmore returned, and he was talking on the piazza with Mr. and Mrs. Allison for nearly half an hour afterwards. But Chloe was patiently waiting for him, and meeting him in the hall on the way to his room, presented Elsie's request. "Yes," he said, "see if she is awake, but don't disturb her if she is not." Chloe softly opened the door, and the little girl started up, asking in an eager whisper, "Did he say I might come, Mammy?" "Yes, darling," said Chloe, lifting her in her arms and setting her down on the floor. And then the little fairy-like figure in its white night-dress stole softly out into the hall and ran with swift, noiseless steps across it and into the open door of Mr. Dinsmore's room. He caught her in his arms and kissed her several times with passionate fondness. Then, sitting down with her on his knee, he asked tenderly, "What does my darling want with papa tonight?" "I wanted to tell you that I was very naughty this afternoon, and didn't come home until just as the tea bell rang." "And you were very glad to find that papa was not here to make you sup upon bread and water, eh?" "No, papa. I didn't eat anything else," she said in a hurt tone. "I wouldn't take such a mean advantage of your absence." "No, dearest, I know you would not. I know my little girl is the soul of honor," he said, soothingly, pressing another kiss on her cheek. "And besides, I have just heard the whole story from Miss Rose and her mother." "And you wouldn't have let me had anything but bread, papa, would you?" she asked, raising her head to look up in his face. "No, dear, nothing else, for you know I must keep my word, however trying it may be to my feelings." "Yes, papa, and I am so glad you do, because then I always know just what to expect. You are not angry with me now, papa?" "No, darling, not in the very least. You are entirely forgiven. And now I want you to go back to your bed and try to get a good night's sleep, and be ready to come to me in the morning. So good night, my pet, my precious one. God bless and keep my darling. May He ever cause His face to shine upon you and give you peace." He held her to his heart a moment, and then let her go, and she glided back to her room and laid her head on her pillow to sleep sweetly and dream happy dreams of her father's love and tenderness. She was with him again the next morning, an hour before it was time for the breakfast bell to ring, sitting on his knee beside the open window, chatting and laughing as gleefully as the birds were singing on the trees outside. "What do you think of this?" he asked, laying an open jewel case on her lap. She looked down, and there, contrasting so prettily with the dark blue velvet lining, lay a beautiful gold chain and a tiny gold watch set with pearls all around its edge. "Oh, papa!" she cried, "is it for me?" "Yes, my pet. Do you like it?" "Indeed I do, papa. It is just as lovely as it can be," she said, taking it up and turning it about in her hands. "It looks like mamma's, only brighter and newer, and this is a different kind of chain from hers." "Yes, that's entirely new, but the watch is the one she wore. It is an excellent one, and I have had it put in order for her daughter to wear. I think you are old enough to need it now, and to take proper care of it." "I shall try to, indeed, dear, darling mamma. I would rather have her watch than any other," she murmured, a shade of tender sadness coming over her face for a moment. Then, looking up brightly, "Thank you, papa," she said, giving him a hug and kiss. "It was so kind in you to do it. Was that what you went to the city for yesterday?" "It was my principal errand there. And now how sorry and ashamed I should be if I had taken advantage of your absence to eat all sorts of good things." "I think we are never sorry for doing our duty," her father said, softly stroking her hair, "and I think, too, that my little girl quite deserves the watch." "And I'm so glad to have it," she cried, holding it up and gazing at it with a face full of delight. "I must run and show it to Sophie." She was getting down from his knee, but he drew her back. "Wait a little, daughter. I have something to tell you." "What, papa?" "We have paid our friends a very long visit, and I think it is time for us to go if we would not have them grow weary of us. So I have decided to leave Elm Grove to-morrow." "Have you, papa? I like to travel, but I shall be so sorry to leave Sophie and Miss Rose and all the rest. They are so kind, and I have had such a pleasant time with them." "I have told you the bad news first," he said, smiling. "Now I have some good. We are going to take a trip through New England and the state of New York, and Miss Rose and Mr. Edward have promised to accompany us. So you see you will not have to part with them just yet." Elsie clapped her hands at this piece of good news. "Oh, papa, how pleasant it will be! Dear, dear Miss Rose, I'm so glad she is going. And Mr. Edward, yes, papa, I like him too, but I love Miss Rose the best of all, don't you, papa?" Her father only smiled and said Miss Rose was very lovely, certainly. The breakfast bell rang, and she ran down, eager to show her watch. It was much admired by all, but there was great lamentation, especially amongst the younger members of the family, when it was announced that their guests were to leave them so soon. Why couldn't Elsie stay always, they asked. Why couldn't she live with them? They would only be too glad to have her. Mr. Dinsmore laughed and told them he could not possibly spare Elsie, for she was his only child, and he had no one else to share his home. "But you may stay too, Mr. Dinsmore," said Sophie. "There's plenty of room, and Mamma and Rose like to have you read to them." Rose blushed and shook her head at Sophie, and Mr. Dinsmore replied that it would be very pleasant to live at Elm Grove, but that Elsie and he had a home of their own to which they must soon return, and where she would be very glad to receive a visit from any or all of them. End of Chapter 16, Part 2, recording by Joyce Martin.
Chapter 17 of Holidays at Roselands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Holidays at Roselands by Martha FINLEY. Chapter 17. Have you arranged your plans in regard to what places you will visit and in what order you will take them? Asked Mr. Allison, addressing Mr. Dinsmore. We have not, he replied. That is, not very definitely. Only that we will visit New England and New York. Elsie looks as if she could make a suggestion, remarked Miss Rose, with a smiling glance at the bright, animated face of the little girl. I should like to, if I were old enough, said the child, dropping her eyes and blushing as she perceived that at that moment she was the object of the attention of every one at the table. We will consider you so, my dear, laughed Mr. Allison. Come, give us the benefit of your ideas. Still Elsie hesitated, till her father said pleasantly, Yes, daughter, let us have them. We can reject or adopt them as we see fit. Yes, papa, she returned. I was just thinking that Valley Forge and Paoli are both in this state, and I should like very much to see them both. I call that a very good idea, said Mr. Edward Allison. I have always intended to visit those historical places, but have never done so yet. Then let us go, said Rose, for I, too, should like very much to see them. If the plan suits you, Mr. Dinsmore, she added, giving him a smiling glance. Perfectly, he said. It will be a new and interesting experience to me, as I have never visited either spot, though quite familiar with their history, as doubtless you all are. Then we may consider that matter as settled, remarked Edward with satisfaction. Elsie hardly knew whether to be more glad or sorry when the time came for the final leave-taking, but the joyful thought that Miss Rose was to accompany them fairly turned the scale in favor of the former feeling. And though she brushed away a tear or two at parting from Sophie, she set off with a bright and happy face. They spent several weeks most delightfully in travelling about from place to place, going first to Valley Forge, a little valley so called because a man named Isaac Potts had a forge there on a creek which empties into the Schuylkill River. He was an extensive iron manufacturer. The valley is a deep, short hollow, seemingly scooped out from a low, rugged mountain. The Americans had their camp on a range of hills back of the village, Washington his quarters at the house of Isaac Potts. It was a stone building, standing near the mouth of the creek. Our friends were invited in by a cheerful old lady living there, and shown Washington's room. It was very small, but they found it interesting. The old lady took them into it, and, leading the way to an east window, said, From here Washington could look to those slopes yonder and see a large part of his camp. Then, lifting a blue sill, she showed a little trap-door, and beneath it a cavity, which she said had been arranged by Washington as a hiding-place for his papers. On leaving that house, our little party went to view the ruins of an old flour mill near by. This was going in those Revolutionary days, said the old lady, who was still with them, and soon after the Battle of Brandywine, before the encampment in this valley, the Americans had a large quantity of stores here in this mill. Washington heard that the British General Howe had sent troops to destroy them, and he sent some of his men, under Alexander Hamilton and Captain Henry Lee, to get ahead of the British, which they did. Knowing there was danger of a surprise, they had a flat-bottomed boat ready to cross the river in, and 2 vedettes out on the hill to the south yonder, pointing with her finger. Well, the soldiers had crossed the river, and were just going to begin the work they had come to do, when the guns of the vedettes were heard, and they were seen running down the hill with the British close after them. Lee, the vedettes, and 4 of the other men ran across the bridge, the enemy sending a shower of bullets after them, while the others, with Hamilton, took to the boat. They were fired upon too, but got away safely. The 2 parties had got separated, and neither one knew just how the other had fared. Lee sent a note to Washington telling his fears for Hamilton and his men, and while Washington was reading it, Hamilton rode up with a face full of distress, and began telling the General his fears for Lee. Then Washington relieved him by handing him Lee's note to read. Our party thanked the old lady for her story, and Mr. Dinsmore asked what more there was to see. "There's an observatory over yonder on that south hill," she said, pointing to it. "It was there a large part of the American army was quartered. On the hill, I mean. If you go up to the top of the building, you can see a good deal of the camping ground from it." "Thank you," he returned, slipping a silver dollar into her hand. "We are all greatly obliged for your kindness in showing us about this interesting place and refreshing our memories in regard to its history." The others thanked her also. Then, taking a carriage, they drove to the observatory she had pointed out. They were told that it stood on the spot where Washington's marquee was placed on his arrival at Valley Forge. It was a neat octagonal structure, about 40 feet high, with a spiral staircase in the center leading up to an open gallery on the top. They went up and found it gave them a fine view of the greater part of what had been the camping ground. "Our troops came here from Whitemarsh, if my memory serves me right," said Edward Allison. "Yes," assented Mr. Dinsmore. "It was Washington's decision that they should do so, as here he would be near enough to watch the movements of the British army, then in possession of Philadelphia. He wished for one thing to keep the foraging parties in check, protecting the people from their depredations." "Wasn't it in the winter they were here, papa?" asked Elsie. "Yes, and the poor fellows found it terribly cold, especially for men so poorly provided as they were with what are esteemed by most civilized people as the barest necessities of life, food, clothing, shoes, and blankets." "Yes, I remember reading about it, how their poor feet bled on the ground as they marched over it, with neither shoes nor stockings," said Elsie, tears springing to her eyes as she spoke. "And didn't they suffer from hunger too, papa?" "Yes, they did, poor fellows," he sighed. "They endured a great deal in the hope of winning freedom for themselves, their children, and their country. They had not even material to raise their beds from the ground, and in consequence many sickened and died from the dampness." "It is really wonderful how they bore it all," said Edward. "They certainly must have been true and ardent patriots." "We were told that Washington's marquee stood just here in that time," said Elsie. "What did he want with it when he had a room in Mr. Potts' house?" "He occupied the marquee only while his men were building their huts," explained her father, "then afterward took up his quarters in that house." Our party now returned to their carriage and drove to Paoli, some 9 miles distant. They were told that the place of the massacre was about a quarter of a mile from the highway, and leaving their vehicle at the nearest point, they followed a path leading through open fields till they came to the monument. They found it a blue clouded marble pedestal, surmounted by a white marble pyramid, standing over the broad grave in which lie the remains of the 53 Americans found in that field the morning after the massacre, and buried by the neighboring farmers. "Papa," said Elsie, "won't you please go over the story?" "If a short rehearsal will not be unpleasant to our friends," he answered kindly. Both Rose and Edward assured him they would be glad to listen to it, and he at once began. "It was but a few days after the Battle of Brandywine that Wayne was here with about 1,500 men and 4 pieces of cannon, Washington having given him directions to annoy the enemy's rear and try to cut off his baggage train. This place was some 2 or 3 miles southwest of the British lines, away from the public roads, and at that time covered with a forest. But for the treachery of a Tory, the British would have known nothing of the whereabouts of these patriots who were struggling to free their country from unbearable oppression. But Howe, learning it all from the Tory, resolved to attempt to surprise and slaughter the Americans. The dispatched General Grey, who was afterwards a murderer and plunderer at Tappan and along the New England coast, to steal upon the patriot camp at night and destroy as many as he could. Wayne heard that something of the kind was intended, but did not believe it. Still he took every precaution, ordered his men to sleep on their arms, with their ammunition under their coats, to keep it dry, I suppose, as the night was dark and stormy. Grey and his men marched stealthily on them in the night, passing through the woods and up a narrow defile. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning that they gained Wayne's left. Grey was a most cruel wretch, called the No Flint General because of his orders to his soldiers to take the flints from their guns, his object being to compel them to use the bayonet. His orders were to rush upon the patriots with the bayonet and give no quarter. In that way, in the darkness and silence, they killed several of the pickets near the highway. The patrolling officer missed these men. His suspicions were aroused, and he hastened with his news to Wayne's tent. Wayne at once paraded his men, but unfortunately in the light of his fires, which enabled the enemy to see and shoot them down. Gray and his men came on in silence, but with the fierceness of tigers. They leaped from the thick darkness upon the Americans, who did not know from which quarter to expect them. The Americans fired several volleys, but so sudden and violent was the attack that their column was at once broken into fragments, and they fled in confusion. 150 Americans were killed and wounded in this assault. It is said that some of the wounded were cruelly butchered after surrendering and asking for quarter. But for Wayne's coolness and skill his whole command would have been killed or taken prisoners. He quickly rallied a few companies, ordered Colonel Humpton to wheel the line, and with the cavalry and a part of the infantry successfully covered a retreat. "Then did all who had not already been killed get away from the British, papa?" asked Elsie. "Not quite all. They captured between 70 and 80 men, taking, besides, a good many small arms, 2 pieces of cannon, and 8 wagon loads of baggage and stores." "Weren't some of the British killed?" she asked. "Only 1 captain and 3 privates, and 4 men were wounded." The story was finished, and having seen all there was to see in connection with it, our travellers went on in their way and pursued their journey, not feeling at all hurried, seeing all they wanted to see, and stopping to rest whenever they felt the need of it. Elsie enjoyed it all thoroughly. There was no abatement of the tender, watchful care her father had bestowed upon her in their former journey, and added to that was the pleasant companionship of Miss Rose and her brother. Mr. Edward was very kind and attentive to both his sister and Elsie, always thinking of something to please them or add to their comfort; and both he and Rose treated the little girl as though she were a dear younger sister. Elsie was seldom absent from her father's side for many minutes, yet sometimes in their walks she found herself left to Mr. Edward's care, while Rose had Mr. Dinsmore's arm. But that did not trouble the little girl, for loving them both so dearly, she was very anxious that they should like each other. And then she could leave Mr. Edward and run to her papa whenever she pleased, sure of being always received with the same loving smile, and not at all as though they felt that she was in the way. End of Chapter 17. End of Holidays at Roselands by Martha Finlay.